I'm thrilled to have Giles Hutchins with us today on the show. Giles, welcome.
It's a real honour to be here with you, Rafael. Thank you very much for inviting me.
It's my honour, I can assure you, and I've been really looking forward to having this discussion and getting into the weeds with you on all things regenerative leadership. You know, I'm not going to go into your huge background and your number of books, although you do have a book coming out very shortly, which I'm looking forward to reading. I've got pretty much all the others. I wanted to start by helping the listeners understand how you first connected with nature.
Well, as you know, my work's pretty much about attuning with life, with nature. And that actually started very early on in my life for me. Quite young, I had a couple of quite profound experiences. You could, I think, looking back on them, call them out-of-body experiences. One in particular I remember, but there were a couple before, but one around the age of 7. I spent some time in nature where I was definitely in another place altogether in terms of my consciousness. And that stuck with me for some time. There was much, much more to life than meets the eye or that we think about in our heads. And I used to watch nature programs a lot with my parents, thanks to them, you know, David Attenborough and so forth, and often used to question this view that sort of nature was all about sort of competition. And got me to start questioning the kind of civilization that we're living in. And that then sent me down many roads, exploring many other things.
I really enjoyed the chat with Obama and David Attenborough, actually, where they had the discussion, and they say that, you know, all children are inherently fascinated by nature. It's something that we have to kind of unlearn. Did you go through that kind of unlearning process and have to rediscover it? Did you kind of have to conform to the normal world and business?
Well, I actually made a decision. So a couple of years after those videos, I mean, I went on my own sort of journey of activism and getting involved in activism, and quite quickly finding that a lot of that was fear-based or anger-orientated, projecting onto other people, blaming other people, and didn't really ring true to me. So I quite quickly found that business was really being given as the reason why all of these things were happening, the reason why we were exploiting other human beings and nature was apparently because of business. So I actually vowed to myself, I gave myself a promise, which I'm still in the process of living up to, which was to find out about really what's behind business. What is the strategy? And how can business become in harmony with life? Why is it singly at odds with life? Because I didn't understand that. So I then committed to going into business. So I kind of went into business with my eyes open. But yes, 15, 20 years on, I mean, I'm now 25 years on from being in business. But I can remember catching myself. This was then when I was running business transformation for KPMG in the UK. So I had quite a senior role, complex programs of change, working with different organizations around the world. I was understanding about business, but I could find myself starting to lose my connection with nature. That was something happening, especially with lots of global travel. And that actually helped remind me about when to make good on my promise.
And you were doing some fairly, corporate kind of roles, weren't you? You were deep in the system at this time. You spent a good portion of time with KPMG, for example, and I know you had, people reporting to you and lots of the pressures that we all feel perhaps in corporate life, and went on to do other things. What allowed you to kind of cross the threshold and say, okay, I'm going to give up some of the trappings of wealth and standard business, if you like, to take your steps towards writing the books that you have and starting to coach and train people on this journey?
It was my own unconscious, my own self, or you could say nature itself was knocking at the door. I remember quite clearly starting to have these sort of slight, almost outbursts in meetings, saying things like, well, gosh, do we not realize that this project is, inherently damaging life or something like that? And people would look at me and go, what? What? And stuff was starting to sort of blurt out of me as I was starting to question what I was doing. I'd learned a hell of a lot. And of course, I was being offered, it was an interesting time for me, I was being offered this new role. So I was a director at the time. And as you say, I had a number of people, over 40 people reporting to me and contractors and a P&L. And, so it was a significant business role with lots of complex risks. Some of the programs were multi-million pound programs. And on the one hand, much of my self-identity was coming from this being this senior person in KPMG and so forth. On the other hand, it was, felt like it was time to move, to change, to unfold. And they offered me this role to become, a much more senior level, to run the SAP practice, which was starting to become a next step potentially, much larger practice. And I remember at the time thinking, gosh, where do I want to go with this? And deciding to make good on my promise. It was actually a David Attenborough program again, much later. I was sitting in my flat in London with a hangover on a Sunday evening and watching this program. And it was around 2005. And he said, and he got told off for doing this. This was the first time he said something a bit more political. At the end of the program, he said, the reason why we are seeing challenges in nature is because of human activity. And if we don't do something about this now, then the beauty that you've just been watching on this program will be irreparably damaged. The time is now. And when he said that, it was exactly what I wanted to hear. I was almost asking for a sign. What do I do? Do I carry on down this road and wait till I become CEO of a company or a senior leader and then make change happen, which was kind of convenient because then I could stay in the system? Or was the time to actually make good now? And when he said that, I was very clear. I remember standing up in my apartment and just allowing myself to cry for about a good couple of minutes, just all the sort of, I suppose, suppressed stuff I'd kept within about how nature and life was being damaged. I allowed out and wrote a note to myself to say, I begin. And in the morning, I woke up and didn't need to even look at the note. And that really was the beginning of quite a significant metamorphosis for me, because I then moved into sustainable business, became global head of sustainability for a big multinational called Atos Origin, with 150,000 employees. And then after that, doing that for about 5 years, again, realizing I needed to shift again, and I needed to leave corporate life altogether. So I was already then on the journey. It was that tipping point then around 2005 to actually just live my purpose, which is still driving me today, which isn't easy because you have to change all the time. You have to adapt, you have to evolve, just as things get comfortable. And this is what nature's teaching us. Just as you're starting to get into your groove, you then need to adapt. You need to continuously evolve to be in tune with life.
Completely. And I feel a lot of what you're saying has resonated with me. Certainly the book that you did with Laura Storm, Regenerative Leadership, was one of the key books in inspiring me to make a step personally as well, to try and align my industry, my investment practice with my principles and values. So can you help us understand a bit about this story of, or journey of separation and reconnection that's highlighted in that book with Laura?
Yes, and that draws upon The Illusion of Separation, a book I wrote before, which is, after leaving corporate life, I did a whole exploration into why have we come to this point where we have lost connection with nature. And that was a really interesting exploration. And what I found was actually for the vast portion of human history, we've had a deep sense of connection with nature. And to the question you just said around David Attenborough's podcast, as children, we wake up and we come into the world with this innate sense. So it's innate within us. And what we've done, and it really happened, it's the seeds of this shift happened around the Neolithic revolution and the agricultural revolution, when we started to domesticate and control nature. And yet for even that period of time, we lived in relative understanding of the interconnectedness and the depth of nature. It wasn't until the scientific revolution, much later, 400 years ago, that we started to see what we call the rise of rationalism. So very reductive ways of viewing life, ourselves, each other, and the world around us, and also the organization. So the organization's machine. And from that comes Taylorism, comes scientific management theory, Milton Friedman's maximization of short-term profits. All of that feeds out of that mechanistic worldview that really came about 400 years ago. And even though today we now know, and over the last 100 years we've known, profound thinkers like and scientists like Einstein and Schrödinger and Bohm and so forth have really explored how life is innately connected and we are participating within that interconnect. We now know scientifically and biologically that that's how life works. we're still holding on to an old worldview of mechanistic materialism. And so the journey of separation, if you like, that we talk about in the book, Regenerative Leadership, is one of drawing away from that connection with life, which one could argue, if one wanted to be positive about this and see everything as a learning, is helping us get perspective on who we are, so that when we reconnect back into life, we're doing that consciously rather than just being in connection with nature. By learning to fall out of connection with nature, when we come back into connection, we are consciously aware of the awesome potential of life. And that reconnection, I would argue, is the journey that we're going on now, that remembering. Because the very challenges that we've created, climate, COVID, conflict, all of these challenges which come out of human behavior, are spawned from that mechanistic materialism, being completely out of touch with life. We've created all sorts of systemic challenges, which we're now having to deal with. We can't deal with them with the same level of thinking that created problems, that mechanistic materialism. That's just going to create further problems. And we find that sometimes in the sustainability movement, we're getting too caught up in managing carbon rather than looking at the big picture about what this is really about. And when we shift into reconnecting, which is what regenerative leadership, leading by nature, is all about, when we allow that world view shift to happen in us as leaders and in our organization, then we start to allow ourselves to flow with life again. And that reconnection is what's going to wake us up and enable us to deal with and to thrive in these volatile times. Without that, we are going to struggle and we won't evolve. So really, this is an hour of humanity's reckoning. Are we able to wake up and realize the awesomeness of life, or will we not be able to evolve?
And that's a big ask, really, because we're all kind of, we all grow up, we all go to, if we're privileged enough to go to business school, etc., we learn Henry Ford's approaches and all of these kind of things. They've all been kind of indoctrinated into us. So we're kind of a product of the environment that we have grown and been educated in. So, systems change, which is an area obviously that you're focused on. How is that, how is it feasible when we're all individuals to create a swarm or a herd of thinking in the direction that you're discussing? How do we do this?
Well, the answer actually, fortunately, is in the shift itself. First, we've got to recognize that we can't deal with these systemic challenges with that old level of thinking. And the more we do so, the more we actually create more tension, more stress. And that tension and stress leads to two things: either one, breakdown, or two, that dissonance creates the capacity to make change happen. So back to my personal story. When I was creating that dissonance inside myself, I was buffering up against my own unconscious. I could have just suppressed it, carried on, taken the next job promotion, carried on in the system. But that would have come back and haunted me until I realized my fuller potential. So instead, that dissonance created an insight for me that enabled me to change. And that's the same for us now as a collective. That dissonance creates the potential for the breakdown leading to breakthrough. And also, when we look at systems change, Donanella Meadows, the systems scientist, clearly pointed this out many decades ago. The greatest leverage point for transformation for any system is to shift the consciousness, to shift the worldview. And when we start working with that shift in consciousness, and I work specifically with leaders for this reason, because they have a catalytic effect on the people around them, what we explore in complex systems when they shift is that we don't need to shift everyone. In fact, what you need is about 6 to 10% people, and they start shifting the other trend makers around them, and things start shifting quite quickly. So think of the metamorphosis of the caterpillar to the butterfly. To start off with, you have these imaginal cells that are trying to struggle to allow the butterfly to emerge, but the caterpillar sees them as a threat and challenges them and undermines them and tries to kill them. But as they persist, a tipping point is reached, and around, say, 6 to 10%, those imaginal cells persist. Then the caterpillar suddenly starts to realize that actually maybe they are part of the emerging future, and then starts to help them rather than undermine them. And quite quickly, then the transformation unfolds. And so we're in this unique moment now where actually I believe people are starting to recognize that these imaginal cells, people talking about regenerative cultures, regenerative design, regenerative leadership, new ways of working, more conscious ways of operating, B Corps and so forth, all of this is starting to shift, and people are no longer holding back from it, but going, hang on a minute, let's start exploring that.
Some of your work talks about sort of flowing or swimming with the stream rather than kind of working against it. That momentum kind of reminds me of if it's only 6 to 10%, it sounds achievable, right? We only need 6 to 10% of leaders to start to realize that is the direction, or that's the wave that's coming, and they need to start swimming out to surf it. And we create momentum. I don't think you've seen. I don't know if you've seen the TED talk about is a guy dancing crazily at a festival, and he's just on his own for about 5 minutes, and then someone joins him. As soon as one person joins him, shortly after it turns into a full-on rave with like 30, 40, 50 people all piling in. So I mean, that's encouraging if you feel that it is achievable, because I think one of the challenges that we experience is this kind of sense of screaming inside, in a way, where it's like not knowing how to observe a degenerative type of organization or company where you see practices where you think, look, this could be better, but being able to actually play a part in that sounds more achievable. I mean, is your work instigated? I would assume certainly your coaching work is by already people that are interested in the logic of life, or it's not something that's happening from a decentralized kind of lower echelons of the organization. We're still in hierarchies. How do most people start to work with you? Where do they discover you, and are you seeing more momentum around these things?
Yeah. Well, just yesterday, for instance, we had 24 leaders from a construction company here at Springwood Farm, ancient woodland, where I centre a lot of my international leadership work. And out of that group, there were, I would say, a number of those leaders. They were middle managers or senior to middle leaders across the organisation. There would be a number of leaders in there that are on that cusp of shifting into next stage leadership and really becoming aware of living systems and of attuning to life. All we're doing is sowing seeds, and that they then go on their own journey, just like I did back then, when they start going through their own shift. And it's inevitable. The shift will happen. The forces that we're dealing with in life are far greater than we can imagine. But what happens is our ego gets in the way, or we believe, because of how society is, that we need to focus on getting the next promotion and paying the bills and so forth. We keep in fear, and then so things buffer up in us. So all I'm doing as a coach is creating the courage in people, not to allow that fear to get the better of them, but to feel courageous enough to start taking steps forward through their own threshold. And when they do, life serves them. Doors open. I mean, my own life is a prime insight for me on that. It's proven to me what this is about. I mean, I knew it in my out-of-body experiences as a child. The innate sense of how life works was in me, but to actually have it proven to me through my own life, for instance, how Springwood Farm came to me, how, I meet people and how synchronicities happen. So those doorways open after you have started to take courage. So life needs to know that you're prepared to cross the threshold. So, for instance, the leaders who were here yesterday, you would then start coaching and working with a small group of them, and they would then start actually going on their own path, and their lives would fundamentally start changing. And people have to be prepared for that, and that's why I coach people through those journeys, because it changes their worldview, it changes their meaning making, relationships in their lives, habits, hobbies, all of that may potentially change.
Is it like an intervention though? I mean, I think we are now so bombarded by demands, stress, pressures, expectations, certainly in kind of Western lifestyle and working practices. Like, how do you make space for that kind of realization? Because it could sound a bit like, what are we talking about? This sounds very hippie. Why are we talking about trees and life and things in a business context? What's it got to do with it? Logic of life. What's the logic of life? I understand, making machines and process, and I understand what I've learned, but how is life logical? It looks disorganized to me.
So that's, I think, probably why I've gone through the journey I have done, and why perhaps I had to go through business, because I can that's my job, is to quite quickly work with a senior leader. So I coach a lot of CEOs from around different organizations around the world. Often some of them don't ever meet me. It's all online, and we can still go through very deep journeys together. I'm quite proficient now in being able to allow leaders to let their guard down. This isn't actually hippie or woo-woo. I taken hundreds of leaders into nature. None of them have ever reported back. They may have initially thought it was,
Yeah.
and there was an apprehension. And so my job is to quite quickly get them beyond that by feeding some of their desire for sort of fact figures, but and how this relates to the future of business and how things are shifting and what that means for their culture, for their value proposition. I mean, I've done business strategy for some of the largest corporations around the world, so I know how to speak that language. And I've worked with culture change, business transformation for 2 decades. So that's not a problem. But you then need to move beyond that. Otherwise, you're just getting caught up in that mechanistic doing, that mindset of, fixing things. So you start out with that base so people feel comfortable, but then you quite quickly move into, okay, so what's really going on? And it then does become, so there is an initial intervention to your question, and that can be 3.5 hours here in nature or a couple of hours online. So it doesn't have to be long. The session here yesterday, because it was a group of over 20 people, was 6 hours. They had that intervention. All of them leaving the day were profoundly different than when they arrived. But that's just the beginning. You can't just go, that's it. It's then a case of working with people who are ripe for that metamorphosis and going through a journey that needs some psychological safety and some developmental process to help them go through that shift. And then it can take, 6 months, year, 2 years, depending on where the organization, where the leader is, through profound shifts, enable them and enable their businesses to become future fit. I have not yet met a leader who doesn't actually want to be future fit.
Completely, because there's so much change in the world, and there's also a lot of uncertainty, and there's macroeconomic and geopolitical and other just supply chains, other things that are changing all the time. So actually resilience is a massive area, I would think, for companies, and their ability to be agile and move in those directions. And when something changes, and that is something, resilience is absolutely inherent in nature, really, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, if there's one thing that life is showing us is how to deal with emergence and creating organizations and leaders that are able to adapt to change, to constantly adapt and evolve. Life is ever changing and it's full of tensions. So getting comfortable with those tensions, getting comfortable with the uncomfortable, working with those tensions, allowing those tensions to become crucibles for creativity, for innovation, for new ways of working. That then becomes the fuel that allows us to unlock our brilliance within our organizations and allows us to work with other organizations across our business ecosystem in far more effective ways. So it's that bakes in resilience, and I would say it's probably even more than resilience. It's the capacity to thrive and continuously evolve.
Yeah, in business terms, it's turning threats into opportunities because you can see and act on them in advance of others in a way.
And so it's a shift from a kind of fear-based, narrowed down perspective into an opening up. Essentially it's just making leaders more conscious and more able to run their organizations. But essentially it's also about ensuring that their organizations become life affirming. So it's not just about becoming more profitable. Profit is an important part of this. You need to be able to survive. It's about actually working with life. And that is a power that when you work with and unlock, is there to help you and helps serve us as manifestors in a way of creating organizations that do good in the world rather than this bizarre idea that business should be about destroying life, which it doesn't have to be.
Yeah, I mean, it's just evolved that way, I think, from the mindset from post-war yield obsession, basically, and we've become, some of your work quotes Dr. Ian McGilchrist's amazing book, The Master in His Misery, is it? Left brain and right brain thinking, and certainly I feel like the world is more polarized than ever. You're either left or you're right, or I think perhaps the evolution of more technical platforms, social media, etc. It's just an echo chamber or feeding you things that are deliberately kind of polarizing, and it seems strange to me that something that connects us all on a daily basis also slightly creates a barrier between us and the living world in a way, because we live under strip lights or we're not really the only time people are getting real connection sometimes with nature is when they book a 2-week holiday to try and detox from what should be what is seen as the pinnacle of a career, for example. And why is it that people with very little income on the streets can be, by all means, pretty much happy, or seem very happy outwardly, and people with a lot of resources can often be the most depressed and unwell? That certainly resonates with some of the observations in your books. And what can people do listening to this that want to start to think more along these lines, aside from reading your work and connecting with you? What are simple things that people can start to do to try and change this consciousness inside themselves?
Well, in the last chapter of Leading by Nature, I give some powerful tools. Some of this is about just the quality of presence, the quality of consciousness that we bring to each moment. So you just talked about this. We live in an age of distraction, and yet it's up to us to get distracted by that or not. We do have choices to make. So we've got to watch our own habits. So when this group of leaders came to me yesterday, for instance, the first thing I did when they all arrived, much to their amazement for some of them, is to say, right, we're going to leave your mobile phones either in the safe here or in the car before we go into them. And they were like, oh my God,
terror.
At the end of the day, all of them said, wow, thank God we left our mobile phones away. They just would have, because after lunch, when people are just getting into the depths of things, one or two of them said, oh, this would usually be when I'll be looking at my mobile phone. And we just get distracted. Just back to that 2-week holiday that someone books, as you say, to celebrate the next stage in their life. They take their phone with them and then constantly have the urge to check in on what's happening. So we can make our own discipline, and that's part of coaching leaders. So stillness is a very important thing, whether that's a morning meditation, whether that's just going for a jog, whether that's journaling at the end of the evening to reflect on things. Really connecting inward, an inner journey is very important. And noticing our distractions, noticing our habits. It's titillating to go to the Twitter feed or to check our emails or to pick up the phone. But what happens if we don't? We get back to our own selves. What is this journey all about, if not to become more of who we truly are? So that's a very simple one, but not necessarily easy. And that goes hand in hand with another tip, which is surrender. Surrendering to life, letting go. So much of the challenge that we have is that we get caught up in wanting to control, wanting to manage, being fearful about, oh, what if? So I better micromanage, or I better know what's happening. But actually, if you allow things to let go of it, that doesn't mean to say you become whimsical or you don't project manage or so forth. You need to keep a handle on things. But at the same token, there's a letting go, there's an easing, not being so tightly held on things, not being so stressed. That letting go allows things to flow more. And that's important as well. And then I would say you can start noticing the synchronicities, noticing the patterns and the signs of what's happening around you, and trusting your own gut and your own intuition, which again goes hand in hand with actually finding stillness. Because until you deepen your connection with your own self, it's sometimes difficult to listen to your intuition or your gut. So we have all the natural capacities there. Those are very simple little tips. And often what I'm doing initially on a coaching journey with a leader is just inviting them to start getting used to and reconnecting with their own supernature, what I call their own supernature, their own intelligences that they have within inside themselves, so they can start trusting themselves and trusting life.
And when they get back into the organization, I mean, how does this practically manifest itself in terms of decisions or things that you've seen change inside organizations that are kind of open to more regenerative thinking and more regenerative approaches? What does it become?
So there's a whole shift really around the organization in becoming future fit. I mean, I talk about in Leading by Nature in quite detail. I talk about the inner nature of the leader and the outer nature of the leader, the way in which they show up and relate to others and what effect that has on the organization. And then I talk about the organization, the inner nature of the organization being the culture, the ways in which we make decisions, the ways in which we engage in feedback and share and learn and work together through distributed decision-making and more self-organizing ways of operating, and the outer nature of the organization, the value propositions, the ways in which we're showing up and engaging with stakeholders, and the shift that we're seeing at the moment through the Internet of Things, through a more collaborative approach to business and sustainability and so forth, a shift from products to services to community participation. And what does that mean for the organization? And how can those value propositions shift? So there's a whole chapter in there on a detailed case study about an organization a consumer goods organization moving into the future. But there's also throughout it sort of insights on what does that mean for the culture in terms of becoming more developmental, more learning orientated, more reflective, more tuning in to how we unlock the brilliance of our people, more emergent, so more self-managing, more agile, and more evolutionary. So we listen to the evolutionary purpose of the organization, and we allow ourselves to become more purposeful every day. And that's subtly different from purpose as a kind of mission statement or a values charter or a PowerPoint pack or brand. This is something that is lived in the day to day that we bring out of ourselves, and we work with the system. And there's tools that I provide in there about working with living systems, approaches like systemic enablers, so that we listen to the system and adapt and evolve. So we bake in that future fitness every day.
Now more than ever, companies need to be fit for the future, and it's a changing future. And I think, you're touching there on evolutionism and stuff. I think one of the nice things that comes up in one of the books certainly is that, Darwin is somewhat not misquoted, but it's kind of misunderstood the whole survival of the fittest, because I think that's also something in business. Dog eat dog. We're a fitter company. We're going to win over that company. And that wasn't actually what Darwin was saying by fittest.
No, and that, again, there's lots of corruptions that happen in that mechanistic materialism. And that left brain hemisphere approach that you talk about, Ian McGilchrist's work is fascinating, is that we tune things out. We tune out the living world and we get caught on the bits and bytes. And so we drill down. So the whole of life then becomes this sort of separate species struggling for survival in a dog-eat-dog world. And that's not how life is taught. And yes, we have corrupted some of Darwin's work. It's now called neo-Darwinism, which is a corruption, the selfish gene. Actually, fittest was about fitting in, adapting, forever fitting in and adapting to your niche. And that's upgrading your relationships, continuously evolving. As Lynn Margulis, the award-winning biologist, says, life did not take over the world through combat, but through networking. And businesses know this. Astute business leaders know that they need to form adaptive partnerships, and people working with the Internet of Things and selling over e-commerce know that you need to have an array of ambassadors and social media partners. And so you have to have flexible relationships now to work in that fast evolving market. And that requires trust. It requires a connection. It requires shared values, all of which requires authenticity, which comes back again to the consciousness of our own leaders.
And do you think that this change is happening in our lifetime? Is it, there's obviously tremendous focus or thoughts around 2030. We're a long way short on SDGs, and it's been, I think the Stockholm Resilience Centre are predicting, we're going to hit 11.5 out of the 17 that we were supposed to hit in 2030 by 2050. So are we going to see an acceleration? Are we getting the 6 to 10% that are needed to create this kind of transformation and to kind of allow the caterpillars to start to dissolve? Where are we on this, and what's your prediction for the future?
Yeah, well, I've been very vocal about this work for over a decade now. And when I first started talking about this stuff and writing articles in Sustainable Business Networks and writing my first book back in 2012, The Nature of Business, many people in the more mainstream sustainable business movement I could imagine, would say that, they felt my work was too sort of on the edge. And now, of course, 10 years later, I'm not getting that at all. I'm getting, oh, wow, this is kind of what we need. So even in those 10 years, which in the grand scheme of things is very minor, I've noticed a shift. And in terms of my work and clients contacting me, significant change. So yes, no one can predict the future. I can say that for sure I'm seeing an upswell. Is that upswell fast enough? I think we run the risk again of doing what we always do, which is bringing a mechanistic materialism to even trying to predict the future. Yes, there's a need for metrics and graphs and goals. They're all very important. And yes, there certainly is a need for urgency. What's more important is the quality that we bring to that urgency. Because if we come in with a rushed, fearful, attacking, angry mindset, then actually that's not the evolution that we want to create. Things are happening. things are unfolding. Things work in complex systems in very different ways than we're used to. And I have an innate knowing, I wouldn't even say it's a belief, but a knowing that we will evolve. I don't know what that looks like. And what I'm gesturing towards is that it needs to include a deep connection with life on Earth. Quite an obvious statement, quite frankly. And yet it still seems to be far from lots of the discussions on the table today.
Well, that's the beauty of a lot of certainly regenerative leadership, and why it resonated with me. The book was just because so much of it was really completely blindingly obvious but beautifully simply explained. Because I think as humans, we all feel connection with each other. We all love nature in one way or another. We've all got cats and dogs and domesticated even animals and things, and we've just kind of lost the way a little bit around all these systems and things that we're trapped inside. And what's beautiful right now, I think the quote that I don't know if you mentioned it, the Gandhi quote that covers some of your work, but how you make the change, and then though the kind of world presents itself to you, is something I've noticed just transitioning into impact investing. Many people have limiting beliefs. How can you invest for impact? It's about risk and return. But actually, if you change the lens, if you look out there are incredible people, and they're incredible founders, and they're incredible companies, building not only profitable, high growth, exciting companies, they're doing it in a way which is helping the environment to flourish, helping us have abundance rather than creating scarcity. And that to me is the biggest advert for your work of all. So Giles, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for joining us on the show. And I would advise everyone to, follow your work or get involved in some of the stuff you're doing. Certainly read your books, because they're brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for being interested in the work. And thank you for what you do, Rafael. You're an exciting edge of all of this, and we are making the change happen. So thank you very much.